My name is Lee Franco, and I'm the department chair for Kinesiology and Health Sciences. And I'm going to be the least important person that you see tonight. So it's very brief that I'm going to have the honor in introducing you to our new dean, Dean Mallett. And I wanted to just give this quick notice that if you go to the College of Humanities and Sciences website, so just type in Humanities and Sciences VCU, you will see a tab at the top that says Current Students. When you click on that, there'll be a student town hall that Dean Mallett's going to be speaking on November the 17th, which is a Tuesday at 6 p.m. So you can register to attend. So please take the time to do that. And with that, I want to turn the camera over to Dean Mallett.
Thank you. And thanks for encouraging people to attend the town hall. The CHS Leadership Council organized it. I'm just going to be there to listen and learn. So it's great. So thank you for, I appreciate the invitation from the department to come to this talk today. I am excited to hear Dr. Keith's presentation. Turns out she and I have a lot of things in common through where we're from and then where she works. My daughter is affiliated with them as well. So in any case, it's a very small world and I'm pleased to be here. One of the delights of working in a university is getting the chance to learn and hear new ideas. And I'm happy to be here. So my job is actually not to introduce the guest, but to introduce the person who will introduce the guest. And so I'm here to introduce Ed Acevedo, who is the Associate Dean for Strategic Initiatives and is a professor in Kinesiology and Health Sciences. And he will be introducing our guest speaker today.
Thank you, Dean Mallett, and it is a pleasure to introduce our speaker to this year's Kinesiology and Health Sciences lecture. We have a long history of having some of the most highly regarded and recognized leaders in our field, and this is another, Dr. Keith is another example of that. As many of you know, she's the president of the American College of Sports Medicine. And so all of her colleagues agree that she's a leader in the field and she's done so much for the field already. Having said that, I'm going to start my introduction with some of her academic background and some of her accomplishments in the field so that we get an idea of kind of where she's come from and how she's built her career. She started her undergraduate degree just up the road at Howard University. From there, she went on to do her master's degree at the University of Rhode Island and then continued to the University of Connecticut to complete her PhD. At that time, the University of Connecticut was one of the top programs in the country, and many would argue that it's still one of the top programs. And she studied with another leader in the field, Larry Armstrong, who was her major advisor. I'll throw in that although she thought she was done after she finished a PhD, as her career developed, she decided that she wanted to alter her research focus a little bit into a little broader community-based work. And so she went on and did a master's degree, a second master's degree in clinical research at the institution that she now works for. She started as a physical education teacher. So you might be a little surprised at that, but for someone like me who's been around for many, many years, almost all of us started as physical education teachers, or at least training to be physical education teachers, because that was the only place you could learn about physical activity and health. And then the field, of course, has developed to where we are today. She had a number of positions leading to her position at Indiana University, Purdue University. And she's been now at IUPUI for about 18 years. And her career there has followed the standard progression from assistant professor to associate to department chair. And today she is the associate dean for faculty affairs in the School of Health and Human Services. I have to tell you about her awards. Very, I think, unusual for faculty, and it's hard to be good at the three major areas that a faculty member is supposed to be excelling in, which is teaching, research, and community engagement or service. She's won awards for her teaching. She's won awards for her research, and she's won awards for her service. That's really tremendous. And again, in my experience, it's a bit unusual to be able to excel in all three. And I think she might propose that for her and in her mind and in how she does her work, they overlap. And I think you'll see some of that as she goes through her presentation. She's been honored by her institutions that trained her, both the University of Rhode Island and the University of Connecticut have given her alumni awards. One of the extra things that we do in service is mentor. She has a long list of excellent professionals that she's mentored and supported throughout her career. I have to tell you that often, and mentorship is not necessarily rewarded. And so, excuse me, it's simply something that you do because you feel like you want to help and help somebody else. She's done that with students. She's done that with professional colleagues. She's done that at the national level. She's developed mentorship programs for national organizations. She's consulted with national organizations to help them develop their mentorship programs. And most often, they're focused around mentoring women and mentoring faculty from underrepresented groups. I now have to talk about her research, of course. If we look at her research, it started in maybe almost a biochemical lab orientation. And as she grew as a scholar and as a professional, she began to broaden her interest in physical activity and clinical, the use of its use with clinical populations and health. Interestingly, she's looked at physical activity and how it can address health disparities, which I think is really, really interesting. Her research progressed from internal funding to a K award to now over $12 million of funding for her research and another $3 million of funding for her service. I have to end this somewhere. I can tell you that she's got a long list of publications. She's done reviews for journals. She has contributed in so many ways. Maybe most importantly, she claims or she reports that she's wired for service. And I think that's the approach that she takes with everything that she does. We're just so delighted to have you here, Dr. Keith. We're honored to have you here, and we're excited to hear what you have to say today. Welcome.
Thank you, Ed. I don't know if, oh, okay, I know I got the instruction that when I talk, I am seen. So I'm going to go ahead and share my slides so that we can get started. But also, I wanted to say, perfect. Oh, okay, I can see everybody now. I just wanted to say that was a great introduction. And at some point I was thinking, how did he know all of that information? Because it's not written down anywhere. So you have truly demonstrated that you're an investigator, because you must have done some digging to learn some of the information that's not anywhere in my bio or online. So I really appreciate that warm and detailed introduction. I also wanted to thank Dr. Franco for inviting me and the faculty and students from the Kinesiology and Health Department for the robust conversation that we had last night. I want to say that some of you sent to me private messages in the Zoom chat that I didn't see until after you were gone, and I really appreciated the comments that you shared. And I just want to say that within this presentation, you're going to see me go in a lot of different directions that at times will appear somewhat convoluted to you, because there isn't one direction that you can take to pursue research, and especially what I'm talking about, community-based research. I also want to say that there's not one path to take as you pursue your professional career. Um, as Dr. Acevedo said, I went in a lot of different directions before I found the right one, and I still sometimes take off in other directions when something is interesting to me and I want to pursue it. So there's no right way to do your career, and there's no right or wrong way. I should say there's no right or wrong way to pursue your career. There's no right or wrong way to pursue your education, and there are lots of opportunities to move in a variety of directions to pursue research. So having said that, and thank you all for coming this evening, I wanted to just go ahead and get started. And the title of my presentation is Physical Activity, Taking Steps Toward Health Equity. And when I was preparing this talk, I considered the diversity of people across the many communities between where you live and where I live, and what wonderful, challenging work we face, because by the very definition of health equities, solutions vary among diverse populations and diverse communities. So I want to begin this journey with a quote from one of our nation's great leaders, the former US Surgeon General, Regina Benjamin. She says, "We can't look at health in isolation. It's not just in the doctor's office. It's got to be where we live, we work, we play, we pray. If you have a healthy community, you have a healthy individual." So I'm going to give a brief overview and start with a very general definition of what I mean by underserved populations. I'll then discuss the social determinants of physical activity, which is mirrored through the social determinants of health. I'll then transition to make the case for why we should use physical activity to achieve health equity. And then I think it's necessary, as I get into that, to point to moments in US history that have impacted human rights, civil rights, and as a result have historically and currently influenced the ability to participate in physical activity and to overall be healthy. Next, I'm going to present opportunities in the form of physical activity disparities in certain populations. I'll then offer 3 cross-sectoral strategies that can be utilized to influence change. I'll remind everyone that we must continue to build the evidence through research and best practices. And finally, I'll end with suggestions of what you can do right now to increase physical activity participation for everyone. So later on in this talk, I'll present specific groups of people who are less physically active than other members of the US population. But for now, I'd like you to think more generally about those who experience health inequities, including those who reside in an underserved area. They have little or no education and a family income that's below 150% poverty. And as you can imagine, these groups are not mutually exclusive. So why do these inequities occur? Like the social determinants of health, the social determinants of physical activity can be explained by psychosocial, cognitive, and emotional factors. So this is the social ecological model of physical activity, patterned after the social ecological model of health. It describes how one construct fits into another and can influence whether or not a person will be physically active. So physical activity and active living are at the central to the model, which includes individual determinants such as beliefs, gender, age, and ability, the social environment such as culture, social cohesion, income, and equity, the built environment, including transportation, land use patterns, community design, and green space, and the natural environment, including air, water, weather, and topography. And here I've listed some of the social determinants that explain greater physical activity participation, including greater health knowledge and better problem-solving skills that can help people make more informed choices when making a choice is possible, because it's not always possible. People are also more likely to be physically active when they have more flexibility in their schedules, and there's social support to do so from coworkers, friends, and/or family members. As physical activity professionals, it's our responsibility to improve social norms to help make the active choice the easy choice. Both structural and environmental factors also contribute to the social determinants of physical activity. Here I list the built environment, which includes macro environmental factors such as enhanced green space, sidewalk connectivity, and traffic calming measures that contribute to more walkable communities. The other influences that I'll list here, quality housing, transportation, and rec facilities, are also part of the macro environment that contribute to physical activity and health equity. But I'd also like you to consider micro environmental factors. What's inside the place where people live, work, play, and pray that continue towards steps towards health equity? Addressing both macro environmental and micro environmental factors to achieve health equity through physical activity is the low-hanging fruit. Physical activity has the potential to positively influence every societal sector and social justice issue. So when considering the root causes of health inequities and social injustices, I had to get a little bit out of my comfort zone. I'm obviously not a historian, but I care about history, and we should all care about history. But historical events got us here, and we have to think about them as we identify solutions that will help us reach our desired outcomes. So don't worry, I'm not going to say much about this because, as I mentioned, this isn't my area of expertise. But I present this to remind us that both the US economy and infrastructure were established by slave labor. And as I was reading about this, I got some perspective when I learned that the average cost of a young, healthy male slave was approximately $30,000 in the economy of the 1700s. Yep, I said $30,000. It made me think about the movement of slaves from property to people and the value of human life and how this history influences the ability to practice healthy behaviors today. So the US progressed and the abolition of slavery occurred about 60 years before the start of the Civil War. And during Reconstruction period, attempts were made to address inequities of slavery and its political, social, and economic legacy through interracial democracy. The progressive era went from the 1890s to the Roaring 20s and presented creative opportunities in the arts and in science toward real community progress. This was also a time of political reform and social activism to address problems caused by industrialization, urbanization, immigration, and political corruption. And 100 years after these old problems happened, they're new again, and they're impacting the ability of some people to be safe in a healthy manner today. The Niagara Movement was a civil rights group founded in 1905 with Black supporters from the US and on the Canadian side of the Niagara Falls. This organization was dedicated to social and political change for Black people and demanded an end to segregation and discrimination, as well as equality of economic and educational opportunity. The Niagara Movement resulted in the National Association for the Advancement of Colored People, or the NAACP, that remains a powerful political force today. World War I galvanized Black people in their efforts to make America truly democratic by ensuring full citizenship for all people. However, Black soldiers served in segregated units and were involved in protests against racial injustices. Between wars, there was a swelling of Black artistic and intellectual expression known as the Harlem Renaissance. Unfortunately, these achievements did not win political, economic, or educational equality, and racism remained a powerful force in American life that prevented many from thriving in ways that could positively impact their health. This slide presents many of the watershed moments that impact health equity today. I stopped in the late 1980s because there's already a lot to take in here. I know you weren't expecting a review of American history this evening, but it's necessary as we continue to consider how to progress. By 1988, several issues related to equity and human rights, race relations, women's rights, and the rights for people with disabilities had been addressed. And I'm in no way suggesting that there isn't more work to be done. In fact, that's the entire purpose of this talk. What's the work that needs to be done, and how do we approach these efforts? So on the next several slides, I will present demographic gaps in physical activity participation. As I do this, I invite you to think about these as opportunities to improve health through physical activity. I'll then present both strategies and specific frameworks that have worked in the past to generate change, both more generally and related to physical activity specifically. So it's pretty well known that kids, as they age, become more sedentary. Much of this is blamed on screen time, but presenting kids with more opportunities to be physically active through policy and practice is an adult responsibility, whether we're advocating for them ourselves or supporting them in their own self-advocacy. Data from the Behavioral Risk Factor Surveillance System show most children and youth between the ages of 9 and 13 reported participating in physical activity during the previous 7 days. 1 in 3 high school students participate in physical activity for at least 60 minutes a day. 14% engage in no physical activity and spend more than 7 hours a day in front of some screen, and only 29% of high school students reported some physical activity during the last 7 days. A few slides back, you saw that the women's rights movement happened in the 1970s, 50 years ago. It was a movement, and yet we're still not moving as much as men. We have to identify ways to help ourselves as well as our mothers, aunts, sisters, and daughters become more physically active by building the science, and again, through education, advocacy, and policy. Gender plays a role in the social determinants of physical activity. Men are more likely than women to meet physical activity guidelines. When compared to girls, boys between the ages of 9 and 15 spend 18 more weekday minutes and 13 more weekend minutes participating in moderate to vigorous physical activity. This also suggests that boys are more active when they go to school than when they don't. And adolescent boys are less likely to report being inactive when compared to adolescent girls. I'm a scientist in the IU Center for Aging Research, and Dean Mallett told us earlier that that's where her daughter works. I just learned that tonight, so I think that's pretty cool. But my focus is on older adults. I'm stunned by how frequently older adults are excluded from the conversation. These valued members of our society benefit from physical activity in ways that are the same as everyone else, and yet, as they age, their physical activity levels, and I actually should say our physical activity levels because I'm in the first group listed in the bullet, decrease. Only 27.5% of adults who are age 50 years old or older reported no physical activity outside of work during the past month. As we age, the percentage of adults who are physically inactive increases. And among older adults, physical inactivity was higher among women, underrepresented minorities, people with one chronic disease or more, and older adults with a higher BMI. Affordable opportunities that are appropriate regardless of chronologic and physiologic age are a must to achieve health equity for all. A child with a disability is more likely to be excluded from physical activity when compared to other children, regardless of the other child's age, race, or socioeconomic status. That child grows up and becomes 3 times more likely to have chronic disease. And while older adults generally are diagnosed with more chronic disease, 54% of all adults with disabilities get no aerobic physical activity. We must create and identify inclusive opportunities for both children and adults with disabilities to have equal opportunities for physical activity participation. Research focusing on physical activity participation among sexual minorities is quite limited and much more work is needed. However, between 57 and 78% of lesbians do not engage in sufficient amounts of physical activity. Nearly 13,000 youth and adults who identified as sexual minorities reported participating in 1.2 to 2.6 hours less of moderate to physical activity per week when compared to their heterosexual counterparts. And lastly, there was no difference in physical activity participation when gay and heterosexual men were compared. I spent a lot of time in this talk talking about Black American history. And unsurprisingly, race is also a factor in the social determinants of physical activity. While the same percentage of Blacks and whites report meeting the US physical activity guidelines, 3% Latinos report meeting the guidelines. There are also disparities in the percentage of children and youth who do not meet the US physical activity guidelines. Black girls are the least active, followed by Latina girls, white girls, Black boys, Latino boys, and white boys. Racial disparities are prevalent in more than just Black people, and as I've presented on these previous slides, the minority groups impacted are more than just racial ethnic minorities. So what do we do about it? So I'm suggesting that we do what we've done throughout history. We use cross-sectoral strategies that focus on economics, the environment, and social justice to facilitate real change. We can use social equity to move toward equity in physical activity by improving access to physical activity resources, addressing basic needs so that some of the barriers to physical activity can be removed, and assessing the maintenance of health and well-being by supporting economic development and encouraging participation in public life. These steps are going to look different depending on the population and depending on the community. I acknowledge that communities can be quite diverse and one size doesn't fit all. However, there are some general steps that are recommended in order to build social equity, and these include facilitating meaningful land use decisions, promoting clean, safe environments, strengthening existing communities, providing multiple transportation options, improving access to opportunities and health promoting resources, and preserving and building upon distinctive community features. I encourage you not to think about this or approach this work from a deficit model. Communities have so much to offer towards this work. It's also important to advocate for those who have a limited public voice. Build inclusive structures that support engagement, use dialogue that reflects diverse social identities, and generate ideas that build capacity and enhance community and quality of life. All too often, communities development results in gentrification, but there are proven steps that can be taken to protect residents during positive growth. Be attentive to smart growth. Retain existing residents and/or businesses within the community, and don't expose people to unhealthy conditions, such as taking over sidewalks and bike lanes to set up construction fences. If this is absolutely necessary, create detours for pedestrians and cyclists. Questions that are necessary to tailor steps toward health equity through physical activity include: what are the most important ways physical activity influences equity? What are the opportunities to address equity while increasing physical activity opportunities? And how can goals and metrics be developed to make equity relevant and achievable to implement? When forming coalitions to implement real change, cross-sectoral social equity stakeholders must be included. Who are they? Well, they're the people who are directly involved in the community redesign, including the residents, city planners and engineers. They're the communities that surround the redesign community, and they're the people who are impacted by the production or destruction of resources. And careful consideration for the communities themselves must be given, including ensuring the community and quality of life are accessible, affordable, and engaging. There must be individual health and well-being for the residents, the users, which include the people who workshop, play, and pray there, and the members of the surrounding communities. And attention must be paid to the economy within a community that's influenced by jobs, skills, wages, benefits, and education. So when addressing social equity, it's important to keep in mind that people tend to be happier in homogeneous groups. This group might be different, but maybe not. I want you to answer these questions in your head. When you attend a class or you go to meetings or you go to other kinds of gatherings back when we could do that, do you usually only sit near someone you know or someone with whom you've had a previous interaction? Maybe you find somebody who's familiar or shares some commonality with you, but maybe not. Whether people here are different or similar to most people are most comfortable where there's trust and social cohesion that's found in homogeneous groups. These constructs, trust and social cohesion, tend to go down in diverse groups. However, diverse groups perform better. This is true both intellectually and economically. The most successful society systems and organizations intentionally build diversity in order to address equity. How do we get this done? Well, we have to use a multisectoral approach, and I turn to 3 political science strategies that have worked in the US and globally to facilitate change. First, the multiple streams framework suggests that the greatest opportunity for change occurs when the streams of problem, policy, and politics are addressed. The problem recognizes that there's a need to focus on an issue through strategic actions. Solutions are presented in the form of policies. The politics describe the implementation and the political climate, the arrangement of constituents, and the national mood for policy. The greatest opportunities for implementation occur when there's a public attention and public support. I point to the White Lies campaign that used the multiple streams framework. How do we make physical inactivity as socially unacceptable as cigarette smoking? The next framework that I'll present is the Advocacy Coalition framework. It aligns groups with the same core beliefs. These groups coordinate and leverage their power. Included is a focus on educating individuals who are able to make changes. Resources that may not be available to everyone are shared across sectors. And when necessary, there are strategies to align policies with politics. Mrs. Obama used the Advocacy Coalition framework to address healthy eating and solutions to food deserts. While some may suggest that these policies and practices didn't stick under the Trump administration, I've never seen so many community gardens as I have spring up during the post-Obama era. Advocates for healthy eating continue to address this issue despite the lack of current national political support. Lastly, the punctuated equilibrium theory recognizes that policy tends to remain the same unless change is warranted. This theory also acknowledges that policy can change quickly under certain circumstances, such as new science, different perceptions, increased media attention and public interest, crisis, or social influence. So I'm jumping back in history again, but the President's Council on Physical Fitness was established in 1957, and it grew out of a scientific paper published in 1953 that showed that 4,400 students in the US public schools were less physically fit in comparison to same-age students in Switzerland, Italy, and Austria. This presented a threat to national security, and the notion was embraced by both the media and the general public. So on June 23rd, 2010, over 50 years later, after the council's establishment, the White House announced a new executive order from President Obama changing the council's name to the President's Council on Fitness, Sport, and Nutrition, and expands the mission of the council to include nutrition. This is a fantastic example of keeping an age-old physical activity problem relevant, and adding obesity is in the public forefront. U.S. physical activity researchers are thrilled with Mrs. Obama's Let's Move campaign and what it's done for physical activity policy. This office focuses on youth. And so the question I pose to you is, how can we get this done for adults? Inclusive coalition building is necessary, but we must also build the evidence, and research must focus on all different kinds of people in communities that are diverse in culture, resources, geographic location, and several other factors that I've mentioned in this presentation. While America has come a long way in addressing disparities in physical activity, there's still so much more work to be done. In addition to what I've described on previous slides, many populations also underrepresented in physical activity and health are underrepresented in research studies. I recommend engaging in systematic and ongoing data collection and analysis that includes those populations that experience low physical activity participation. Populations that are also underrepresented in research include individuals of low socioeconomic status, persons with disabilities, women during pregnancy and postpartum, racial ethnic minorities, sexual minorities, and people with chronic disease, and any group underrepresented in research. Again, we must continue to build the evidence of the benefits of physical activity at both the basic science and behavioral scientific levels in order to influence real change. I've presented a lot of information for you to digest this evening, and you may be wondering what you can do right now. So I've generated a list that summarizes some of the information in my previous slides. First, while you're working to make a better today and tomorrow, don't forget yesterday. History is important. Look for changes that you can influence through the social ecological model of physical activity. Understand how the communities where you live, work, play, and pray can impact physical activity environments at both the macro environmental and micro environmental levels. Join professional and/or community organizations that convene a multi-sectoral group of professionals, and embrace strategies that may be external to your own academic training. In other words, embrace diversity. Remember, diverse groups perform better. And lastly, continue to build the evidence. This is my final slide. That is the summary of physical activity disparities that I presented earlier. I show this infographic to remind us of the available opportunities to take steps toward achieving health equity. I also want to remind you that the roadmap can be convoluted, and the steps that you pursue should be and can be diverse. I thank you for your time, and I welcome any questions or comments that you have.
Thank you, Dr. Keith. I'm going to open it up to if anyone can see on the bottom of your screen, there should be a Q&A tab. Feel free to ask questions and we'll get to them. We have some already in there. And so I'll jump to one to start off with. What measures are being used to capture physical activity specifically among Black women?
That's a great question. And right now, the majority of physical activity measures are self-report measures. So I presented the behavioral risk factor surveillance system. There are other national surveys that are capturing self-report data for all kinds of minorities. And as we know, I think, is that people tend to over-report physical activity. Some people don't understand what is involved in physical activity. So some people don't understand what counts or what the definition of physical activity is. And also when people start being physically active, especially initially, for those of us who exercise, we know that exercise seems to go by quickly when time goes by slowly. So people are over-reporting and it's not intentional. Surveillance is a challenge, and the National Physical Activity Plan, as well as the National Physical Activity Guidelines, are recommending that we identify more objective measures of physical activity participation, and that the focus are on these groups that have disparate physical activity patterns. And so the person who answered this question identified another opportunity, and that is for objective surveillance of physical activity for a variety of people who are regularly physically active or who are not. These are mostly just self-report surveys, and people largely don't understand what counts. And so they're over-reporting and they're reporting on the wrong things.
And just to follow up with that very quickly, it's the same person who asked the question, as they're understanding that the most commonly used physical activity measures do not perform well among Black women specifically. Do you have any measures that you can recommend that would perform better than, say, the IPAC?
Yeah, so even for research, so I was thinking in the terms of population health, but for research, a strategy that I use, and I know that several of my colleagues use, is when we're seeing these women, if you're doing in-person research, human subjects research, we have people participate in physical activity for 5 minutes, just 5 minutes. So even if they aren't normally used to exercising, it's safe to do moderate to vigorous physical activity for 5 minutes so they can see what it feels like. And then it helps them understand what we're asking them about. There is still this issue of people wanting to give you the information they think that they're supposed to give you, but at least if you have a group, and it could be Black women, it could be kids, it could be obese people. If you have them participate in 5 minutes of exercise, and some of them won't make it, they'll say this is too hard, I can't do it anymore. At least they understand what it's supposed to feel like, and then we can ask. So when we're asking about these activities, that's what we're talking about, and it seems to work pretty well.
So we've seen this for the general population, but are the current guidelines for physical activity sufficient, especially for underrepresented minorities?
Yeah, so everybody's physiology is essentially the same. And so the guidelines are really general, and they are sufficient because they are for everyone. There shouldn't be separate guidelines for any group that has demonstrated disparities in physical activity populations. So they are sufficient. They were just updated, and some of the most knowledgeable experts of physical activity in the world served on the advisory panel of the most recent guidelines, and they were, I think, more represented this time than they were for the 2008 physical activity guidelines because there was attention to diversity. We did have some evidence of inequities in physical activity participation, and the Centers for Disease Control and the U.S. Department of Health and Human Services that put out the guidelines, I think did an especially good job of making sure that different sectors were represented, that different demographic groups were represented, and that everybody on the panel, which wasn't true in 2008, everybody on the panel had expertise in physical activity and exercise. So I do think it is sufficient, and that they've done a very nice job of not only writing the guidelines, but also dissemination so that we know that they exist.
Thank you. In your opinion, what sector of public health offers the greatest room for growth, and/or what positions or roles are in the highest demand within the field for future health professionals?
So the public health sector itself is my answer. And we think about national rollout campaigns that have happened to improve health outcomes. And think about what public health information has happened in order to influence public health outcomes, and what comes to mind. And you all will come up with other other messaging that comes directly from the public health arena. But wear your seatbelt. Eat 5 fruits and vegetables a day. Don't smoke. Wear a bike helmet. What am I forgetting? Wear a mask today. There has not been a national physical activity rollout campaign ever. And people listen to public health professionals. They're the experts on health outcomes and improving population health and improving community health. And yet, for whatever reason, public health is not addressing the issue of sedentary behavior or physical inactivity. And so to answer your question about what area of public health, just the discipline, the public health discipline needs to do a better job of identifying strategies, identifying mechanisms of surveillance and communication campaigns to, and it's what I said in my presentation, is how do we do this for physical activity? We've done it for so many areas and even minorly for kids, but for no other population. And we've got to get this done for physical activity. And it's got to be multi-sectoral, but it has to start with public health. I talked about the built environment and about walkable communities, and that's really city planning and infrastructure. I talked about policies, which is really political science, but none of this is going to happen unless the public health officials, including healthcare industry itself, but it's got to come out of healthcare and be the entire population health approach. Unless the messages come from those professionals, the other sectors aren't going to fall in line. So we've got to get them on board first.
Thank you. Is there any consideration of pairing older retired citizens with young children in dance or simple exercise routines for the enjoyment and engagement of both groups?
So if you do a literature search, you will see several examples of where that has happened, but they're one-offs. And so it's, again, this issue of building the evidence. You would think that the geriatricians and social services organizations that provide services to older adults and school districts would partner, and this would be something that could benefit both groups, the older adults and the kids. And there's evidence to support that it happens, but it's not systematic, at least not yet. So yes, that's a great idea and it's a great question. And there's research that supports that it works in multiple kinds of older adult and pediatric populations, but it's not a program that's subsidized by the government or delivered through policy. So it's a great idea. And it has also been shown to work, for example, with kids who are high functioning and kids who have disabilities, and putting these kids together as peer mentors within school systems also happen. And some districts do it systematically, and some districts don't do it at all. And again, through policy and education, this could happen. So it's not just older adults and kids. There's another program, I can't think of who's funding it, but it's a national program and it's called Senior Companions. And it's, again, for older adults who are high functioning to go give company to other older adults who are lonely or who have caregivers who need respite. But the program is so underfunded that you have to have the discretionary time to be able to do it, because they just get a really small stipend. And a lot of older adults are still working and they can't provide that kind of time. So there are lots of great examples of pairing groups with one another to support each other, either in physical activity or just more generally in health promotion and quality of life.
Thank you. So speaking of that, could you just speak very briefly on maybe the causes of why people perform better with diverse groups compared to when they're within the same group?
Sure. So really briefly, if we have like thinking minds, we're not going to come up with new ideas. You're not going to challenge each other, and everything will stay the same. It's really interesting when you put diverse groups together because there's this level of creativity in this challenge of traditional thought that makes people perform better.
Thank you. What's your opinion on the conflicting nature between the current obesity crisis in the US and the body positivity movement that's simultaneously?
So I think you've asked the wrong person that question because I work with obese populations and I'm a physical activity researcher. I don't do nutrition. I know that whether you lose weight or not, your health outcomes are going to be better if you increase your physical activity. And so I don't care, and I tell my research participants, I don't care if you lose an ounce. I would prefer you not gain any weight, and I would prefer you increase your physical activity. And so for me with body positivity, I think regardless of your body type, as long as you're physically active, your health outcomes are going to improve. And I hope that's what this question meant, because I might have misinterpreted it. So send me a follow-up if that's not what you were asking me.
Thank you. To kind of switch gears just a little bit, can you talk about your most pivotal experience of your professional career?
Sure. I've had a lot of them, and so I'm trying to think which one will I choose tonight. Okay, I will choose this one. So I'm very honored to be the first president of the American College of Sports Medicine who wasn't white. So this is a great honor, and I'm really proud that I was elected and that the membership trusted in me to represent this 50,000 member and certified professional organization. However, some of you know, but some of you don't know, that the first time I ran, I lost. And I will point to that as the most pivotal moment in my professional career because I had gone up through the ranks. I was asked to run for the board of trustees, I won. I was asked to run for vice president, I won. I was asked to run for president and I lost. And I went from being completely engaged in my home professional organization with people whom I'm very close to and whom I love and spending all kinds of time with them to nothing, like this huge void in my life, in my professional life. And I had to ask myself, am I going to go in a hole and mourn and stop working hard? Or am I going to go do something else? Because remember, after you leave the administrative council, which is the council of leaders for ACSM, there's no place for you. I had already relinquished all my committee positions. There was nothing for me to do for ACSM but show up and be supportive. And if they called me to ask me to do something, I would do it. But there was no role for me. And so I waited. I said, you know, they're going to need me. I'm a valuable member and they'll ask me to do things as needed. I'm blessed to be about a 7-minute walk from the National Center. So if they need something locally, they call on me and they have for years. But I decided to do other things. So at the time I was an associate professor. I decided to pursue promotion to become a professor. I decided that I was ready to join the ranks of administrators, and I became the Associate Dean of Faculty Affairs. And then I had this chance. We have a really large faculty. Well, I think it's large. We have 77 members, faculty members in our school. And so I had the opportunity to help 77 people succeed every day in their work, in their teaching, in their research, in their service. And I kept myself busy in other ways. And I don't know, Dr. Franco, if I would have pursued these other directions if I had won the first time. And so it made me be a professional that I wouldn't have otherwise have been. So losing made me humble because I lost. And losing also gave me the opportunity to pursue other leadership roles.
Thank you for that. Has the field of physical activity been impacted, or how has the field of physical activity been impacted by COVID?
Yeah, so in a few ways. So I would say First of all, it's affected the fitness industry. And so the brick and mortar fitness centers first were ordered closed during the shutdown phase of the first shutdown phase. We're entering the second, it appears, but during the shutdown phase. And so fitness professionals had to find other ways to earn a living and became really creative by delivering classes virtually or delivering them outside if the weather permitted. And so in some ways it hurt the fitness businesses, but it helped the fitness professionals find other creative ways to make a living. I will also say, and you likely all noticed that at some point when COVID started and the shutdown started and we were all sent home, we started noticing that our homes were cluttered. And so there were these massive cleanouts, which, you won't think of as physical activity, but think about, when you are cleaning out your clothes, or simply doing your laundry, or cleaning out your garage if you have one. There's a lot of physical activity happening there. And so people started to realize, if I clean the inside of my home, that's physical activity and I'm making my environment healthier. I also noticed in our community, and I don't know if it's true in others, that yards were the most beautiful they'd ever seen. And I was actually in a meeting with Russ Pate, who many of you know, led the National Physical Activity Plan, and he made a comment that he did 2 years of yard work over COVID-19, and people are just finding ways to stay busy. I also noticed that people were getting outside and being physically active outside. And this was reported across the US, that city parks and national parks were as full as they had ever been. Trail use was up, bike use was up. Stores were selling out of bikes. The bicycle industry was behind on bike production. So this wasn't observational in such a way that it was only in certain areas. You couldn't buy a bike. You couldn't buy a new bike because families were learning that they could be physically active. It's hard to run with an 8-year-old, but you certainly can cycle with an 8-year-old. So physical activity increased. Our concern now is that in many states, the weather's changing. And historically, people who are regular exercisers who don't like inclement weather come inside when the weather changes. And now there's safety concerns with exercising inside, but also some people are just simply not comfortable exercising inside, and we're concerned that they're going to become sedentary. And so we are really delivering messages to our constituents about talking to people and pointing to communities that are regular exercises in cold weather. What are the strategies to do that safely and comfortably? So COVID has affected physical activity and exercise in a lot of ways. One other thing that I'll say is that as we all sit in front of Zoom in Zoom meetings all day and are not going to meetings that we would normally walk to at work or walk to at campus, people who are actively transporting to work who don't have to do that anymore, working from home decreases physical activity in terms of transportation, physical activity, and exercise. And so that is another way. There are lots of ways that COVID-19 has affected physical activity and exercise, and we just really have to be cognizant of ways to replace transportation, exercise, or those other opportunities of exercise that will go away as the winter months approach. Well, they're here. It's just like it was 70 degrees in Indianapolis yesterday. So it's winter. I mean, it's November, but it doesn't feel like it. So.
I think we have time for just a couple more questions, but I want to follow up with that because you can even take it a step further. And a lot of the high school and elementary school children are going to, once we recover from COVID, be going back to school. And in doing so, in a lot of programs across the country, physical activity and physical education is marginalized where it's removed from the elementary school teachings. And so what are some educational ways and programs to get more high school students to perform physical activity that we may be more innovative in the future?
So you've touched on actually a couple of good points. And the first is that, our school district just shut down again. We went to all online learning starting Monday. Actually, today, the way it was structured, Friday was going to be an online learning day anyway, but so today was the last day of school for many students. They're all going home until January at the soonest. And what I noticed during COVID-19 and the initial shutdown is that schools did a really great job of making sure families were fed. They had buses driving around our communities delivering food. They had food distribution. You could drive by a school in your community. They didn't do anything for physical activity. It did nothing to make sure kids were being physically active. And I will say an exception is Michigan. The state of Michigan actually has a really great program that's delivered by Rebecca Hassan at the University of Michigan, who's a physical activity and youth researcher, and she has established a program that kids can get online if they're comfortable being physically active while looking at their PE teacher. They're not on camera, or looking at a PE teacher. They're not on camera, but the teacher is, and they can do workouts with them. So that's available. That's rare. So school shutdowns are a problem, but and the other problem that made me think of what you asked is return to play. So many kids, especially in high school, get their physical activity participation through sport. And in some communities, sport has shut down, and it's really compromised kids in ways that they have not been compromised before. But I think that we, as I've been saying all along, have to deliver messages to parents and to youth who are sometimes independent about what counts. What other things can you do to be physically active? What do you think you would enjoy, whether it's in your house or in your yard or in your driveway or on the street or in the woods? We really have to send some messaging to children and youth about what counts as physical activity and what they can do to have fun. We know, and I work with older adults, but I know that physical activity has to involve friends and fun, or kids aren't going to do it. So what can they do with their friends? And maybe it's their pod that they've been socially distancing with all along. But what can they do with their friends? And what can they do that's fun? And it might be non-traditional forms of physical activity. I'll use my 17-year-old as an example. He spent much of his COVID social distancing traipsing through the woods and going fishing with his two buddies. And so he was walking and he was carrying heavy stuff and he was standing and he was getting fresh air. And so he's not thinking about that as I'm getting physical activity. He's thinking about I'm going fishing and having fun with my friends. And so we have to find other ways for children and youth to be physically active in ways that are fun and healthy.
Thank you. There's our last question. I think you touched on it a little bit, but as we've seen with COVID, nothing is more important than the sense of community. And so in leaving us tonight, if you had to put this into a bullet point type of response, how can the students and the faculty who are here listening to you tonight be better advocates for community involvement in physical activity? And what does that look like?
Wear a mask, wear a mask, wear a mask. And then after that, be out, be role models. Be out and be physically active and be role models. Show people how to be physically active safely. Encourage your friends who are sedentary or who are becoming more sedentary to be active. Encourage your family members and the adults in your life. Go be active with them. Socially support them in ways that are safe, but that are healthy. But I think role modeling is the most important way to be encouraging and to be a role model yourself. And so for the people who are on this webinar, make sure that you're exercising, because you can't support anybody unless you're supporting yourself and your own healthy behaviors.
Dr. Keith, it was truly our honor. As a tribute to Ms. Childs, we're fired up and we're ready to go. And so I appreciate you coming and speaking with us tonight.
Thanks for inviting me.
Thank you very much. And with that, thank you, everybody. And we'll see you back in class tomorrow. Goodbye.